religion?
Well, I don't think most people do. I'd like to think that most people appreciate that Islam is like any other religion. There are fundamentalists, there are mainliners, there are secularists, there are people who look at the religion in different ways. But the bulk of Muslims, of the 1.6 billion people who practice Islam, an infinitesimal amount, are engaged in any type of fanaticism as such that we see with ISIS and other groups. And when he says that Islam is the mother lode of bad ideas, that is horrific. It is offensive, and has been said. It's quite frankly, it's racist.
That was some of the debate. They were also arguing about whether liberals have failed when discussing Islam, the treatment of women, the treatment of gays, free thinkers, and public intellectuals in the so-called quote-unquote Muslim world. I mean, Mark, have liberals failed, do you think, when it comes to this?
I think there's a space for us to push Islam, like all other religions, on issues of gender justice, on issues of equality. But the circles that I travel in, we do just that. Inside the Muslim community and outside of the Muslim community, there are very progressive conversations going on. Is that everybody? Of course not. But I think there is a conversation to be had. But it can't come at the expense of a fair and even-handed analysis, not just of Islam, but other religions. Islam is not uniquely violent or primarily violent or anything or any more prone to violence than any other religion.
Ben, why are you laughing?
Name another religion that does what ISIS and what Al-Qaeda and what many Islamists agree with and support. Do you remember how many people celebrated in multiple countries around the world on 9/11 when the planes hit the towers? All over the Muslim world, they were celebrating in front of mosques. And to say that this is some small group of people, I think we've been very respectful of Islam in this country. I think we have been very compassionate. I think we've been very willing to separate extremists, maybe more than we should, and apologizing for extremists more than we should. But to act as if other religions do this, they just don't. Not in modern day right now. You can go back hundreds of years. But to say that there's other religions doing what they're doing now is absolutely absurd to even imply it.
Ben, would you agree that many countries that practice female genital mutilation are Christian? And would you agree that many countries, for example, in the continent of Africa,
I think there's perversion, yes, but
well,
I'm
Mark,
saying
that doesn't make it right because Christian countries
it doesn't
do
make it right.
No. But I wasn't making an equivalency argument. He was asking what other religion does it. I'm saying here's another religion that does it.
I will say this. Name another religion that the predominant people celebrating the death of innocent people on the anniversary of 9/11 was all over the world in Muslim communities.
Okay,
they celebrated it.
Ben, where's your evidence that the predominant amount of Muslim people celebrated 9/11? Show me any evidence that proves that. Any evidence.
Go look at all of the Middle East. This is where I'm saying you're
what
putting
is the
on
basis
blinders.
of your?
You're trying.
No, Ben, you're ignoring the
basing it on
question.
the people that celebrated. I'm basing it on the people that celebrate after the attacks of 9/11.
But you said the
you
predominant Muslim world. Ben, you said the predominant group. You said most Muslims did the dominant group. The predominant group did this.
I said name another religion that does that.
No, what I'm saying.
The only religion now
Ben,
that does that is Muslim religion.
Okay, all right. I'll respond to both things. First, the implication in your question, which was that Muslims celebrated 9/11, is not only offensive, but it's incorrect, and there's no evidence.
A lot of them did, though.
There's
a lot of them did. It is offensive. I agree with you. A lot of them did.
Ben, what is the source of your information?
Okay, let's talk about this. Let's talk about this because you were talking about the source of information, and this isn't necessarily celebrating what happened on 9/11, but there is a Pew poll that talks about among Muslims about Sharia law and what Sharia law means and stoning people and all of that. And here's what it says. It says that the percentage who favor the death penalty for converts, the majority in Malaysia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Egypt, if we can put the numbers up, Jordan, Palestinian territory, and many other countries don't have a majority, but they still have a large number. And so if you look at that, it may not be the majority of Muslims, but that is that's millions and millions of people. Is that a problem with religion in general or just with Islam, Mark?
Well, I think that's often a problem when you have state-mandated religion, and again, that's something that I think we all find problematic. I would hate to see anyone killed for leaving religion. I would hate to live in a country where that's the case. But there's not necessarily a one-to-one correlation between people who vote yes on that poll and who believe in state-sanctioned violence, who believe in terrorism, who believe in beheadings, who support ISIS. Because if you go to those very same countries that believe that death is an appropriate penalty for leaving the religion, they also hate ISIS. They also don't believe in beheadings. They also
not all of them.
But is it fair as well? Is it fair? Hang on. Is it fair to call Sam Harris and to call Bill Maher, who are noted liberals, to call them bigots because they are asking certain questions about Islam? and they're atheists as well, to call them because they're having a discussion about Islam on television. Is that fair?
Well, I don't think being liberal shields you from being bigoted. There are plenty of bigoted liberals, number one. And number two, I think that it's one thing to have a critique of religion. And it's another thing to have a critique of Islam even, but to bring up fallacious information or unfactual information as a basis for promoting the idea that somehow Islam is inherently violent or predominantly violent, I think is problematic. And it is racist. It doesn't mean they're racist, but that idea is.
Ben, go ahead. I'll give you the last word.
This is the part that really almost makes my head explode, and it's this. You show a poll that is actually talking to millions of Muslims about Sharia law,
10 seconds,
and a lot of them say that they agree with it. And somehow, many people in this country don't want to believe when they're telling the truth about this part of the religion that is incredibly violent to the point of death. Right, think about that.
That's going to have to be it. I'm sorry. And just for time purposes, I'm up against a hard break.